I've got a bit of a history now on YouTube doing floating shelf videos. And if you're watching this video, maybe because you've seen one of the other ones, I put out one a couple of months ago that's gotten a lot of attention in the past, 30 days or so. And the most interesting part of that has just been the number of comments that have come in now, and I've read every one of them, some of them multiple times, which is kind of interesting to see the perspectives that many of you have on floating shelves.
So by building a couple of more floating shelves, I'm going to address some of those questions and comments. Let's get started by showing how easy it is to get rid of the floating shelves from the last video. I had a number of comments from contractors who install floating shelves using long lag bolts that they drill holes for in the studs and then secure them with epoxy or some other type of adhesive. Then they cut off the heads and slide whatever style of shelf they're installing over the rods. I totally understand that reasoning, and frankly, it's the kind of thing that I often do on jobs for customers. I mean, the last thing you want to do is to go to a customer's home and fix or repair something that you've done that's come loose. So permanently fixing the shelf support rods in the studs makes perfect sense. My rods that are installed this way can also be glued in place in the studs. But if you ever want to remove the shelves, if you're living in a rental home or apartment, or just simply because you built shelves that you want to take with you after you sell your home, this method does give you that option, not only of having the strength and performance over time, but also the ability to quickly disassemble and remove them from the wall with an easier repair to make it look like the shelves were never there. I'm going back into this spot with two basic floating shelves, and instead of using the heavier 5/8 inch all thread rod like I did in the last video, I'm using 1/4 inch and 5/16 inch rods to do the installation. Some of you expressed concerns that some of the tools and methods I used in that last video were not things that a typical person that's interested in woodworking might have on hand, and so we're curious if there were other ways to do this with simpler tools. The shelves are a very basic design, and I'm making them the width of a standard 2x4. Shelves can be made in pretty much any style or configuration that a person can come up with. In the end, all you need is just a place to slide the rods through, and your design should provide some overall strength of the entire shelf unit. Beyond that, the challenge is how do you intend to connect it to the rods. Like in the case of many contractors that commented, they use epoxy or some other adhesive to glue the shelves to the rods. Or if you want them to be removable, then you can come up with another method like I'll show you in this video. Since I've used this wall many times, I know where the studs are. I also know where my electrical wiring is in the wall, so I don't really have anything to worry about, but you may, so make sure you know where your wiring is before drilling into the studs. In locating the studs for these two shelves, a great idea came from a number of contractors to use strong magnets to locate the studs. If you've seen the prior video, you know I hit a couple of screws on two successive attempts to drill holes for the 5/8 inch rods I was installing. Using a magnet is just good old common sense, and it's something I've never thought about. I appreciate you guys passing that on. Stud finders are fine, but about half the time it seems like I can't trust what they're telling me. If they're sticking to the wall, that's because there's something metal in it. Magnets will give you the opportunity to easily get real precise locations on your studs. There were a number of questions and comments about whether it's really necessary to tap the studs with a thread cutter before installing the final all-thread rods. To me, it just makes good sense. I don't know if it's really any better than just screwing a rod into a hole that's a little bit undersized for that size of rods, but I think I just have better control of the depth and quality of threads. I've drawn a level line for my rods just like I did in the prior video, and I've tried to hit the center of the studs with my holes. I am using a block that I've pre-drilled pilot holes in on the drill press just to give me a good shot at getting a perpendicular hole going into the studs. The measurements I'm taking are just to assure that I'm getting into the studs about 2 1/4 inches, which seems like a good depth for the rods. Rather than building a T-handle for this video to put in the different types of rods, I'm just simply using an inexpensive tap set to cut 1/4 inch and 5/16 inch threads into the holes. The 1/4 inch threads go in the top pair of holes and the 5/16 threads in the bottom pair. There were also some comments about this process being complicated and overly engineered as compared to other approaches, with which I tend to disagree. You've already seen in this video how easy it was to spin out the shelf rods from the prior video and remove that shelf. Now I'm drilling holes for the taps to cut the threads for the rods. If you're using lag bolts, you are going to drill holes in the studs as well, then spin the lag bolts in and cut the heads off of the lags. I found myself replying to a lot of these comments with the same phrasing, that if I weren't talking about and explaining what I was doing in the prior video and just installing the rods, the process itself would go quite quickly. Some other comments were, why don't you just use a screw gun or impact wrench to run the rods into the holes? And that turns out to be a good idea, at least for getting the rods close to final depth. When it comes to installing the shelves on the rods, I'm simply marking where my rods are on the shelves and drilling holes a little bit larger than the diameter of the rods so they don't bind too much while I'm trying to slide them into place. I've also recessed the holes on the front of the shelves to allow the nuts to pretty much flush out with the front of the shelf. It is a good idea to add washers, particularly for this kind of installation, which I didn't do in the last video. A number of you commented about that. It wasn't an oversight on my part so much, it was just that I wasn't doing a permanent installation of that shelf, and I failed to mention that it was a good idea to use washers in permanent installs. But in this case, you can see as I tighten the nuts down on the rods and begin to compress the shelf against the wall, something very interesting happens. These flimsy rods, particularly the 1/4 inch rods, stiffen quite a bit the more I tighten. Had I used epoxy on the threads of the rods to give the nuts something to really pull against, that compressive strength would even be greater.
Now, the purpose of this video really was to show an installation of floating shelves with lighter durability materials. These rods thinner certainly than what I've used before, and I didn't really know exactly what to expect. I mean, I thought they would do okay, but I'm going to ask some of my engineering friends to comment on actually what's happening here with the tightening down of the nuts on the rods and compressing this against the wall. They can explain it a lot better than I can. But the end result is that once these things are snugged up, they're pretty stout. So I didn't intend to do any strength testing of this at all, but I mean, since they seem to be so rigid, I'm going to put some weight on it. I've got 52.5 pounds. Ow. Yeah, and yes, that does hurt. Okay, so that weight should get certainly a little bit of flex, but isn't going anywhere. So that's on the larger rods, the 5/16, and let's throw it up on the 1/4 inch. Okay, certainly a little more flex. Again, I think my point would be that, and I've said this before, floating shelves can be strong, certainly, but you shouldn't get carried away with loading these things down. I'm thinking between 30 and 50 pounds max, and you adjust the materials that you use to install them to give you the strength that you need. But if you're going to put stuff heavier than that on it, then just put in shelf supports and don't worry about it. Floating shelves have great aesthetic appeal to people in their homes. I love them. I like this kind of look too, with the nuts on the front of them. Folks suggested in the comments that you could cap this off to cover this with a finished piece of trim, which is certainly the case as well. But they're just a great addition to the design and decor of a home. One question was asked about, well, what's the big deal with this? What's the big deal with floating shelves? I mean, why not just use regular shelves? And I think the main point would be, when you put in shelf supports like this and you're stacking these shelves, what you end up with is the shelf supports getting in the way of the usable space of the shelves below. So that's one of the main reasons for me that I like them, because I don't particularly like seeing things like that underneath the shelves if you can avoid it and still get the same function and usefulness out of it. So anyway, pretty impressive. I mean, that certainly has a little wiggle to it, but I mean, it's 1/4 inch rod too.
In addition to floating shelf videos, I have a lot of other content on my channel that deals with things going on around your home. I hope you'll take a look around and check back every week or so and see what's going on around Bob's workshop. I also appreciate all your comments and try to respond to as many as I can. Thanks for watching.